Now we have the floor open for Dr. Robert Strom from Kauffman Foundation. He will speak about creating entrepreneurial ecosystem, the role of the university. So he has the floor open for the coming 15 minutes.
Good morning. I need to check my watch with the flight travel to see whether I'm saying good morning or good afternoon, but good morning. I want to thank the conference organizers, in particular Professor Will Musa, for inviting me here. I'm honored. It's been wonderful hospitality, and I look forward to talking with you now, but maybe more importantly, talking with you over the course of the conference and learning as much as I can from each of you. And I want to talk about the Entrepreneurial University, possibly in a more generic sense than the two previous presenters. But I want to thank both of them for giving me the opportunity to make my presentation a little more brief, because they've covered a good deal of what I was going to say, and that's always the advantage of being of not going first. And I think the major point I want to make in looking at the Entrepreneurial University is the fact that entrepreneurship can't be something different, it's something added on. It has to be something that's very central and very core to the mission of the university. And Professor Ali Baba gave me the great gift of covering that territory in terms of the third generation university. And that's really what we're talking about, is a third generation university. And universities are about teaching, research, and outreach. Outreach, for our purposes, interpreted as outreach into the community to engage in entrepreneurial activity, to benefit the community, to benefit society, to be a welfare-enhancing institution, if you will. And I think the rector's introductory comments today really said it best. That the purpose is not necessarily creating or graduating entrepreneurs, but it's doing what a university does best, and that's graduating knowledgeable citizens who are change seekers, who have an entrepreneurial spirit, and that combined with the notion that that risk is not necessarily a bad thing. And risk aversion is not something to be sought. And the clash many times between the university, which really, by definition, encourages people to do independent thinking and be creative in that thinking, and the community, if the community then doesn't accept that creative thinking, which in large part becomes risk-taking, creates a clash. And it's a very, very important role of the university to influence the larger community and to influence the society in that regard. And if I listen to the comments that the Chancellor of HKUST said in the video, entrepreneurship is clearly a part of the mission. And entrepreneurship must be a part of the mission in each of those three areas in which universities operate. So let me first talk a little bit about teaching. Teaching is key, is critical, is at the core of what universities do and what universities do best. And I think there's no better example of a university that does excellent teaching and entrepreneurship than what Dr. Coffey was talking about in terms of what Babson College has done for the last more than a generation, being #1 university in entrepreneurship teaching. It's taught both within and across disciplines. It's both the undergraduate and graduate level, pre- and postdoctoral, practice and theory, again, consistent with the mission of that university. If the mission of that university is primarily a strong undergraduate program, then that's clearly the focus. If the mission of the university is more graduate and professional degrees and sciences, then that's a strong part of the focus. But it needs to be, entrepreneurship needs to be a part of the mission of the university as it applies to teaching. And in many cases, it's not only pre-doctoral but also postdoctoral. So if a professor is running a lab and there are half a dozen doctoral students and 2 or 3 postdocs in that lab, much of that research is going to be research for research sake, but some of that is going to be involved in an indirect teaching of how do we take those parts of that research that's applicable to solving societal problems in a way that's commercially viable, and applying that in an entrepreneurial way and moving that both teaching and research out to the community. So the research, rather than talk about the research mission of the university, let me talk now for just a couple of minutes about some of what I see as the important research questions in entrepreneurship, which lead to research in entrepreneurship becoming an integral part of the research focus or mission of the university. And the first of those research questions is one, again, that I think the rector covered this morning, and that's look at the impact of entrepreneurship on economic growth or on GDP. If entrepreneurship doesn't contribute to social welfare and economic welfare, we probably shouldn't be doing it as a university. But I think now there's good evidence. There wasn't good evidence 20 or 30 years ago when we thought that entrepreneurship was small business. And we know now that small business is very good. It's very good for individuals, what was already described today as sort of necessity entrepreneurship. And it keeps a lot of family structures going and moving and alive, and then it varies over the course of the business cycle. But if we look at entrepreneurship and how it's related to innovation and through productivity, enhancing economic growth, that's the importance of entrepreneurship to society, is the impact of entrepreneurship on economic growth, and then secondarily on jobs. And the key there, the key that we found over the years, is that it's not necessarily the number of businesses. There are 20-some million businesses in the U.S., only a few million of them actually employ people. It's those few million that employ people and grow that are important. So it's the young, growing businesses that are the key contributors to economic growth. So what about those young, growing businesses? What about entrepreneurial dynamics? So moving from more of a macro to a micro orientation in entrepreneurship research. What do we know about firm and industry birth, growth, and death? And a lot of the discussion here today is around the birth and growth of firms. We don't talk a lot about death of firms. But in the case of firms, as one paper has cited, death isn't always fatal. All right? Death has a lot of byproducts that may be positive. The intellectual property of the firm goes somewhere. The individuals who are part of that firm go somewhere. The individual who started the firm may, if the society accepts it, move on to start another firm. Very few are successful in the first firm. So what do we know about firm and industry birth, growth, and death, and how can we study that? And that brings a variety of disciplinary approaches to understanding how firms come into being and how they grow and what happens when they die. Mostly social science research, but a variety of social science research. And then finally, if we understand that entrepreneurship contributes to economic growth and we understand something about how firms come into being and how they grow, what are barriers to entrepreneurship that we need to deal with in order to encourage those high-growing firms to come into being? Some of those barriers are demographic, one of which I'll pick because it came in the discussion this morning, is education. Bill Gates dropped out of college. All right. Fortunately, and I'm an economist, and economists know there's a problem with dealing with averages. The joke about economists and averages is that an economist could drown in 3 feet in a stream that's on average 3 feet deep. All right, and so we don't really want to focus too much on averages. But on average, entrepreneurs have more education rather than less. All right. In the U.S., there's a tendency for not only a tendency for that to happen in many professions. In NBA basketball, for example, NBA basketball stars are now beginning to have less education rather than more, and it seems to serve them well. It doesn't serve entrepreneurs well. Entrepreneurs have more education rather than less, and in terms of starting those successful high-growth firms, that usually happens around age late 30s or 40s on average. Now, there are certainly exceptions, all right? But education is a key demographic variable. And education, not necessarily business school education, but education, as you would expect in sciences and engineering, but also education in a variety of humanities and other fields is critical. The how to think kinds of issues are very, very important. So barriers to entrepreneurship that are demographic barriers and barriers that are institutional barriers, legal, financial, regulatory, other kinds of institutional barriers that vary widely across country. So what I could talk about some legal barriers in terms of protecting intellectual property, and I'm sure a lot of that discussion is going to take place today, so I don't really need to cover much of that here. And then finally, what about outreach? And outreach in terms of production and dissemination of knowledge more generally. And this is where entrepreneurship fits into the pattern or into the picture of the university, but must be consistent with the first two missions, the teaching and research mission. And to look at outreach, I recently did a research project with a couple of colleagues, one Wai-Fong Bo from Nanyang Technological University in Singapore and Uzi Dahan from the Technion Institute in Israel, to look at university technology transfer through entrepreneurship in terms of faculty and student spin-offs. Our basic thesis was that the strength of a university is its faculty and students, and that's already been talked about. So what is it about faculty and students that contribute to university entrepreneurship? And we looked at a variety of things, which we've really already talked about a good bit of that today. But looked at how spin-offs move out of a university into early stage technologies into companies. And specifically that fourth bullet point, different relationships between students, faculty, and entrepreneurs that can lead to successful spin-off creation. And really, that's what we were trying to uncover. To do that, we did a study at 8 universities, and it was Uzi and Wai-Fong who did the great majority of the interviews. We interviewed individuals at 47 spin-offs from these 8 universities and 130 interviews. And really here, a summary of what we did was look at sort of the stages of technology transfer and commercialization, all the way from the idea generation to when firms are raising funds for their firm. And we came up with 4 what we called pathways to entrepreneurship. All right, and I'll go through those very briefly because I think we'll have time to talk a little bit about them in the panel discussion tomorrow. In the first, it's a partnership between a faculty member and an entrepreneur. The importance of each of these is that they start with the top line is the faculty member's contribution. Early stage, it's the faculty member that's clearly dominant, that clearly dominates the process. And experienced entrepreneurs are brought on, and at a very later stage, the experienced entrepreneur then becomes the one to dominate the process, and the faculty member may remain a part of the scientific community, may keep a share in the business, but generally goes back to what that faculty member is best at, and that's doing and conducting the research. A second path, which was the most common path, over 40% of the cases, is partnerships with PhD students and postdocs. All right? And in this case, the faculty member was also dominant early on, but the PhD student and or postdocs worked closely with the faculty early on and very quickly took the primary responsibility as it went from idea generation and the science of the business into the commercialization and the actualization of the business. And this was the most familiar pathway. It might be in large part because the universities we had in the sample are universities that are all clearly graduate institutions. It wouldn't be the case for universities that have primarily a teaching function at the undergraduate level. And third, partnerships with business school students, faculty, PhD and postdocs, and business school students. And in this case, the business school students and faculty, in many cases, enter at a later stage to enhance that. That was the case in 13% of the cases. I thought that very sad, because what that shows me is there's not a whole lot of relationship between the business school and the sciences that actually move to the creation of businesses. And I think if we can increase this particular pathway, we can do a good job at increasing the likely success of business starts. And finally, pure student efforts. And a lot of these are exemplified in the business plan competitions and other sorts of things. Where there's a variety of forms of student-owned enterprises. And in many cases, at least in the universities we interviewed, PhDs or postdoc students together with business school students, would develop the ideas and form the businesses. And this was 23% of the cases. So what's important? Well, things that we've really already talked about today. So I won't spend time covering those, but it's all of the things that go into universities as bringing entrepreneurship as a key part of the outreach program. And with that, I'll pause and take questions.
Thank you very much for Dr. Strom for showing us that interesting statistics. And the floor is open, like for 2 questions. Okay,
Yes.
Dr. Samir Bayat here would like to.
Thank you very much for the presentation. I have seen this report before, but now my question is, we are mainly undergraduate school. We do have graduate. So how do we, move in this, what you have shown that the model is for graduate students and working. So what do we do if you have undergraduate?
Okay, well, I think you also have a big advantage, because if you were the University of Bologna that started in 1300, or if you were Harvard that started 300 years ago, you would have an institutional structure that would be very hard to overcome. Okay? In this case, you have an institutional structure that encourages the business professors and students and engineering and science professors and students to collaborate and work together. It puts a little more responsibility, I think, on the professor, because if the professor is in a lab with PhD and postdocs, they're much closer in terms of their normal natural interests. So I think it puts a little more pressure on the professor for the undergraduate students in engineering and sciences to excite them about the science and the engineering that they're doing, and then understand that it has these commercial applications. All right. So I think there's both advantage and disadvantage in that.
Samir, you wanna, maybe you wanna, tell the folks that we started to have a strategy to hire more PhD students.
Mm-hmm.
We started like 10 years back. We were like having 5 or 6. Now we have about 100.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we have 20% of our students are graduate students. So.
Yeah, and just as Professor Ali Beba says, be very selective on those students then, particularly the first ones coming in. Yes. Sorry, I've been a professor. I just like to call on people.
Thank you very much. My question is about the university policies in terms of faculty getting involved into entrepreneurship, into startup companies and so on. I know there is a wide spectrum. A university like MIT, a professor can devote 1 day in a week for his consulting and business ventures and so on. In these studies, what are the typical policies for universities that really encourage faculty to be involved in entrepreneurship?
Yeah. That's the, as we say, the $64 question. Maybe it's entrepreneurship 64,000 if it's a business plan competition. That's absolutely key. And I've spent the first half of my life as an academic and clearly understand that. And the differences of when we interviewed at Harvard and MIT, and the differences when we interviewed at places across the street from one another, were like day and night. If you can't get faculty out of their silos, out of their academic disciplinary silos, entrepreneurship is not an academic disciplinary silo. MIT had the strong advantage, just as this university has a strong advantage, of being formed as part of its formation was practical service. And so it has the advantage of having that in its mission from the beginning. So I think that it's extraordinarily difficult for very traditional disciplinary bound universities to make that transition. And that's why Hong Kong has the advantage of being about 20 years old, and to have that as part of the mission is key. And this university is 50 years old, so it's 50, am I right? 50 years old. And so there's not quite as entrenched, but the keys to doing that are extraordinarily difficult. And what we found is where it's not part of the original mission. So a new chancellor comes in, spends 5 years trying to change the mission of the university, faculty say, I'll wait it out. All right. And if it's that tradition bound, it's going to be extremely difficult to change. We'd be interested to hear later from Caltech to see what went on there in a fairly short period of time with the university that is firmly entrenched, but not necessarily the disciplinary perspective.
Great. We have floor for one more question.
Yeah. Okay, here we go.
It's more a comment than a question. To address your question about policies, and so the policies across the U.S. are pretty much the same at the top universities. It's 1 day a week of consulting, and you can do. The difference between MIT and Harvard is not so much the policies, it's the culture.
Yeah.
And that's what's the key, because the policies are the same. And recently, Harvard tried to establish an incubator within their school, and MIT has one. And you can, I haven't visited. People who have been tell me that if you go to the Harvard incubator, at 10 p.m. or 2 a.m., it's empty. There's no one. It's very sterile. And you go to MIT at 3 in the morning, you have people hustling and bustling everywhere, working on things. So it's very much a cultural issue more than a policy issue.
Okay, thank you very much for the valuable comments, and thanks for Dr. Roberts.